One of the most underrated players of my lifetime, at least at bat, was outfielder Bobby Abreu. He was signed and developed by the Astros, but they failed to protect him in the 1997 expansion draft. The Rays, so lost early on, took him with their 6th pick of the expansion draft, then flipped him to the Phillies for shortstop Kevin Stocker. Looking back at some of the commentary from that time, I was pleased to see that we at Baseball Prospectus called that a mistake pretty much right off the bat. As you remember, Stocker played for the Rays for about 2.5 seasons before being released, while Abreu would spend most of the next 9 years with the Phillies as their starting right fielder. During those years, he hit .303, had a .416 on base percentage, and a .513 slugging percentage. Per 162 games played, he hit over 40 doubles and 24 home runs, stole 30 bases, and walked 110 times. You can't ask for much more than that. At the end of that span, he was traded to the Yankees, where he had another few strong seasons. By then he was 35, and so he traveled on to the Angels, as is the fate of almost all 35-year-old ball players. Now, early on, Abreu was considered a good defensive outfielder, or at least his reputation was good, and in 2005, he won the sole Gold Glove of his career. By the time I saw him on a daily basis with the Yankees, he had developed a defensive quirk. He seemed to be afraid of the wall. Whenever a ball was hit high over his head, he went back on it, but if he thought it was going to be anywhere near the wall, he shied away from it as soon as he got anywhere near the warning track. He just seemed phobic about running into the wall. Now, arguably, that was smart. I've certainly told you a lot of stories, Pete Reeser on down, of players who really compromised their careers, not to mention their bodily integrity, running into hard barriers. One ball hit off the wall is a double, but a broken collarbone is 6 weeks on the IL. And if that's the trade-off Abreu felt he was making, then it was an intelligent one. That said, it was sometimes frustrating to watch because it didn't seem calculated like that. It seemed compulsive. It seemed more like, I got it. Oh, wait, I'm panicking. Or maybe I'm confusing him with me on most first dates, and second and third and 29th. You know how it is. This reaction on his part always reminded me not so much of that, but of one famous baseball line, and of all things, a dog the family of my friend and musical collaborator Dr. Rick Mooring had when we were younger, Cody the Shar-Pei. I think of Cody the Shar-Pei often. He was a rescue, and I think I remember this correctly. This makes me sad. He had been abused in some sense by his prior owner. He was still a very friendly dog, but you couldn't approach him from the front because he had learned that bad things happened when someone approached him, and he'd react badly. But if you were behind him and scratched him on the back, or if he chose to back up to you, he was happy to receive your affection. It was an odd thing knowing that dog. I'm a big softy when it comes to animals. I cannot stand to think of them suffering, particularly animals that should have been able to trust the people who were around them. And seeing Cody always made me feel awful about his history, but simultaneously I was happy he'd found a good home with people who I knew were, well, good people, and that I could be kind to him whenever I dropped by. Well, the way that Rick's family explained that very wrinkly dog, they'd always caution me. I'd walk in the door, and depending on who was around, I'd say, hey, Rick, hey, Rick's mom, hey, Rick's dog, and someone would say, don't forget, he's head shy, and they were just doing that not to make me nervous or anything, but to save all three of us, or four, me, the dog, them, their liability policy, the pain, suffering, recrimination, regret that would have come from being bitten by a traumatized canine who just couldn't have helped it. Now, every single time Abreu played a ball into a double because he backed away from the wall, I'd hear that phrase in my mind. Remember, he's head shy. And then I felt sad. The famous line that Abreu made me think of was an example of Padres broadcaster Jerry Coleman's famously odd syntax. I'm not going to look it up. He said something like, the ball is hit deep. Winfield's going back on it. He hits his head against the wall. It's bounced off and it's rolling back to the infield. And I think maybe Abreu heard that and truly feared decapitation at the right field wall. Didn't they actually depict something like that happening during the famous baseball sequence of the original Naked Gun movie? You know, the part with Reggie Jackson, one of those 35-year-old outfielders who went to the Angels. I'm pretty sure they did. In the immortal words of Mel Allen, how about that? Now, do you want an introduction to Dr. Feelgood, Mick? As Abreu's offensive statistics suggest, he was a very good player. Whatever phobias he had about going back to the wall, he came in just fine. He probably came in better than Gary Sheffield. Watching Gary Sheffield come in after a fly ball was like watching the SS Minnow try to complete its 3-hour tour during the opening credits of Gilligan's Island. Abreu's career .395 on-base percentage ranks 21st among players who had at least 5,000 plate appearances in the last 50 years. He had 2 30-30 seasons and another 7 20-20 seasons. I don't know if he'll make the Hall of Fame. He's still on the ballot, having gotten enough support to survive his first 6 seasons, but topping out only at about 20% so far. Unfortunately, he's just one of those players who did a lot of things well, but had almost no black ink, never won an MVP award, and never won a World Series, although his teams did go to the postseason 5 times. Heck, he only made 2 All-Star teams, and he was often criticized for not being better than he was, which is a really presumptuous thing to do if you think about it, in regards to anyone. I mean, who are we to tell anybody that they ought to be better than they have been? Who among us wouldn't wish to be better than he is, or she is, or they are? As I've asked before, weren't we definitionally as good as we could have been? That question drives me nuts. And yes, it constitutes special pleading on my part, and it is a theme of today's episode. We'll have much more of that in the second part of the show. The reason I bring this up is that Abreu is one of many great players to come out of the nation of Venezuela. Luis Aparicio is in the Hall of Fame, and presumably Miguel Cabrera will be there too in a few years. It's hard for me to imagine a player who is likely to finish his career with an on-base percentage below 300 getting a plaque in Cooperstown, but Salvi Perez might just get there someday as well, and so might Jose Altuve, despite having, at the very least, proximity to the Astros sign-stealing scandal. I won't list all the good players from Venezuela, because it's a long list, with 55 players who played upwards of 1,000 games, and that's not even counting the pitchers. Nearly 100 players from there were active in the majors at some point in 2025 alone, including the 2 I just named, as well as Eugenio Suarez, World Series hero Miguel Rojas, the Contreras brothers, Wilson and William, 3-time batting title winner Luis Ariz, and I'm not going to lie to you, I had to stop the tape just now and go back, because the first time I tried to say it, it came out as 3-time batting wiener Titler. He's a free agent right now, and surely every team can use one of those. And I should also mention former MVP Ronald Acuna Jr. Aparicio was the first of the great players to come from that country during the White Sox pennant-winning 1959 season. I love this line. Chicago owner Bill Veeck, who we'll be quoting again also in the second act of the show, was watching when Aparicio, playing against the Yankees, took a throw from second baseman Nellie Fox that was both low and offline, and not only corralled it, but was able to complete a double play. Typical, said Veeck. Luis always makes plays that can't be made. The arrow of current events today makes it necessary for each of us to remember that Venezuela is not the sum of its leadership or simply a target of some sort of American imperialist overreach of a blackmail scheme. It's not that Venezuela isn't a mess as a country, or that it wouldn't be better off with a new government, because according to all accounts, that sort of change is desperately needed in that country. It's more a question of whether the United States should be imposing that change at the point of a gun and with the avowed intention of heisting Venezuela's oil. By that rationale, after we've checked off Venezuela, we'll be off to Cuba to reclaim the bananas and sugar we lost to Fidel Castro's revolution back in 1959. That is, of course, if we're capable of pacifying a country the size of Venezuela. If you add the total square miles of Iraq and Afghanistan, you get 421,307. Venezuela's square mileage is 352,140 square miles, all by its lonesome. If you look at Vietnam, now twice as large as it was back in 1968, it's only 127,930 square miles. Think about how we did in those other places. More to the point, oil is not human beings. We're not worth human beings, Americans or Venezuelans. It's not a value like human life is a value. No country should be beyond the law because someone covets its natural resources. You know, baseball covets Venezuela's human resources, by which I mean players like Aparicio and Acuna Jr., Johan Santana, and King Felix. And what does baseball do about it? It pays them. No one dies, and everyone gets a little bit richer. And that's the way a soufflé is made in the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show, Infinite Inning number 356 in an ongoing series. I am, as always, your congenial host, Stephen Goldman. I am here as ever, along with a cat named Raven just below the microphone, and memories of a dog named Cody on my mind. I hope you too are thinking of pleasing things, cute animals. Why not cute animals? Why should it always be sex and violence? They each have their place, say, in the right movie, or perhaps with someone you love, maybe the latter more than the former, at least I hope so. But again, anything between consenting adults where no one is really harmed, I have no problem with that. On that note, I was scrolling social media earlier. I know, big mistake, but I want to keep up with the news. That's one way to do it. And I saw this misogynist comment. Maybe it had been ported over from Twitter, or perhaps there was this article circulating earlier. We talked to a bunch of 20-something Republicans, and this is how they characterize their values, and putting aside that most of them were like, Hitler, great guy, which made me feel wonderful. They all gave it the Marge Schott caveat, the former Reds owner. Well, Hitler, he went too far, but until then he had some great ideas. Which were what, exactly? He engaged in Keynesian spending, which conservatives today hate. If he hadn't started with the war and genocide when he did, he would have run out of money. There's also just the slight problem that the Schott caveat, as I'm now going to call it, makes no inherent sense. It's like saying, that restaurant was really, really good. I loved it, except the botulism-tainted shrimp gave the entire party food poisoning and killed my mom. Before that, though, before they went too far, they really had some great culinary ideas. It's one of those, other than that, how did you like the play, Mrs. Lincoln kind of comments. It just doesn't work. There's no qualifier you can offer that would make up for the absolute infinite perversity, especially since it wasn't that he went too far later. He was a murderous asshole right from day one. A lot of people in his orbit ended up dead long before the final solution was a thing. And all those right-wingers who were appalled, correctly so, by Jeffrey Epstein, check out Adolf and his niece. She either took her own life just to get away from his abuse, however you want to characterize abuse, or maybe he did the job himself. Now, where was I? See, you give me a topic, like, here, 1,000 words on sex and violence, and I just start going. And that is an example of it, just not a very healthy one, especially for the niece. Yeli Rubal, I believe was her name. She's been gone a long time now, but that's okay, because when he was molesting her, that was before he went too far. It's in the safe zone. The comment I was referring to was something like women protest too much about sexual violence because those 50 Shades of Grey books sure have sold a lot of copies. And number one, I haven't read those books, but as far as I know, they're about consensual relationships for the most part, if not completely. Second of all, reading about anything is very different from experiencing it or wanting to. It is, in fact, a safe way to experience almost anything because it's imaginary. I read George Orwell's Animal Farm, but it doesn't mean I want to turn into a horse. One of the more recent books I read, and it turned out to be on a lot of publications' year-end best-of lists, was called Victorian Psycho, and it's kind of a semi-parody of American Psycho, you know, the thing that got turned into a Christian Bale movie, except this one obviously is set in Victorian England. And there are probably about 50 assorted acts of violence in the thing, mostly murder of people of every age and gender. And if you enjoy that literally, there's something very wrong with you. Certainly, liking the book, or all of the critics liking the book, doesn't mean that they are secretly wanting to participate in murder or to be murdered themselves. This is pretty simple stuff. So how are ya? Happy holidays. We're not quite there yet. As I told you last week, the holidays, Christmas and New Year's, fall directly within the next 2 weeks, right in the middle, when I would be preparing these episodes. But I ain't gonna desert you. I will be here with some shorter episodes. So please do not return them to the kitchen saying that the portion sizes are off. One of my favorite old Jewish jokes. No one goes to that restaurant anymore. The food is terrible. I know, and the portion sizes are so small. Here is where I always tell you what I wrote about for Baseball Prospectus this week, but it got pushed to Monday, my submission for this week, for various reasons. So I have nothing to tell you about, but feel free to drop by the site over the weekend, see all our transactions coverage and prospect rankings, and then I should be there with something under my byline Monday morning to start your week. If you're really unlucky, it'll sound a lot like the last 10 minutes. So what do you say? Should we continue on our journey to better understand the present via a trip to the past? Last week, I promised you a Casey Stengel story in this spot, one which had its humorous moments, and that is going to be the subject of the second act of the show. Our subject, can a manager ruin, in quotes he said, a prospect? I think the answer is yes, and I even think there were a few during the Yankees and Mets years that Stengel probably didn't help, but I also think that the three players I'm about to tell you about were not among those that he harmed significantly. Two of the three even said that he helped, but that was not a universally shared opinion. Now, one of these players I very briefly in the past, like for 15 seconds, brushed by one aspect of the story, but we're going to go into a lot more detail this time and, again, talk about two other players as well than I did in that much earlier episode. And so, as always, let us take a brief pause, seek some refreshment, see if any advertisers wanted to spend some time with us this week. And on the other side, we'll go back to the immediate reaction in October 1948 when, of all teams, the Yankees hired Casey Stengel to manage, and then we'll go even further back to Boston and the Braves. Hang with me, won't you? And I'll see you on the other side. Among the several reasons that the Yankees hiring Casey Stengel to take over as manager in October 48 was initially met with consternation, two stand out. His personality seemed 180 degrees from the very sober-minded, if not literally sober, sort of the opposite actually, Miller Huggins and Joe McCarthy, who had been the managers for most of the prior 30 years. He wasn't actually all that different in some regards. Not less intense, but in certain contexts, more intense. And I'll get to that in a moment. But at the time, he was thought of as a big goofball, and they were thought of as leaders of men, even though McCarthy, for example, would sometimes have to take time off to dry out, and, well, Babe Ruth once dangled Miller Huggins off the back of a moving train. It's easy to forget that as late as 1926, the soon-to-be nuts columnist Westbrook Pegler was writing, with some accuracy, "The Yankees are a bunch of swell-headed boobs who think their manager is a sap." At that time, the public didn't realize that the public Stengel was a facade, and a guy that sometimes said and did funny things was different from the private clubhouse Stengel, who could be either supportive or hypercritical, depending on what he thought the player needed or deserved, and yes, depending on his mood and his level of patience. Just like any other person, and as he got older, just like any other person of grandpa age. Until they understood that, and I'm not sure they understood it during his lifetime, he was a clown. And that's why Bill Veeck, I said I would be quoting Veeck again, who didn't know Stengel at that time, but found his Milwaukee Brewers being managed by Stengel in 1944. Veeck was away in the war and couldn't be reached, so he didn't get a say even though he was the operating partner. He wrote a very angry letter to the other partners complaining that Stengel was mentally a second division manager. That is, he is entirely satisfied with a mediocre ball club so long as Stengel and his alleged wit is appreciated. The 1944 Brewers won the American Association pennant under Stengel. That wasn't really noticed, or it wasn't enough to change the image of him, nor did the 1948 Pacific Coast League championship that he won with the Oakland Oaks, and that was what stamped his ticket back to the big leagues. That wasn't enough to change it either. It didn't make up for the other strike against him, which was his 6 seasons as manager of the Boston Braves, so embarrassed of themselves at that time that they were, for a few years, called the Boston Bees. And they played not at National League Park or Braves Field, but in the Beehive, an underfinanced team that just couldn't get going, even when it came up with some decent young players. They were, and I always say this, literally bankrupt, just so you don't think I'm being hyperbolic. And as I'm sure I've told you before, when he finally left the team, after a run that spanned from 1938 to 2/3 of the way through the 1943 season, they owed him money. They stood in very strong contrast to the Red Sox, who still didn't win anything for decades, but definitely had a jolt put into them by the spending of Tom Yawkey starting in 1932. Tom Yawkey took over the Red Sox from Bob Quinn, J.A. Robert Quinn, who, not satisfied to fail as Boston's American League owner, and we've talked about this extensively, went up the street and decided to fail as Boston's National League owner. So in addition to having to carry the burden of contrasting with the Red Sox in short order, but not short enough to spare everyone or anyone's reputation, World War II hit, curtailing any possible youth movement that the Braves might try really picking up steam or achieving any kind of culmination. Stengel was hit by a car, and the team was sold to a new owner who didn't think much of him. In short, Stengel came in after the previous failed administration. The team treaded water for a few years. Then the war came, and treading water became an achievement. Treading water and also being interesting was beyond their ability to achieve because, well, they didn't have the money, and there were a few young players to spend it on anyway. And so what did you have? You had people going through the motions. And yeah, Casey could still say the odd humorous thing or make a sarcastic comment. But really, the whole thing had gone stale. The veteran Boston sports writer Harold Case wrote, "It was more fun losing with Stengel than with 100 other managers. Unfortunately, Boston fans did not have the benefit of Stengel's company." Not that all of the writers felt that way. There was a columnist writing for a now defunct paper, the Boston Daily Record, who is remembered primarily today as a Ted Williams antagonist. His name was Dave Egan, and he wrote under the name The Colonel, although he wasn't one. A lot of what he did write about was what a terrible, selfish failure of a player Teddy Ballgame was. But he also greatly disliked Stengel, even though the Braves had been moribund for years before he arrived and would be for several years after he left, although the rebuild did eventually pay off in the 1948 pennant. His complaint was actually similar to the one that Veeck made, but it specifically focused on young players. Stengel, he said, is a great guy except for those who work for him. He's a funny guy, too. Always funny at somebody else's expense, and the somebody is usually within hearing distance. So he wound up with a sullen ball club, and the majority of the young players hate him. He ruined some of the young players, yet he always remains funny in his cruel and malicious way. Egan had some specific players in mind, and I want to talk about them now. 2 of them were infielders, and that brings us back to one of our recurring themes here, which is, could you have been better than you actually were, or is what you did, well, what you did? And to argue otherwise is to disagree with settled fact. It's like saying that a rock could have been a mermaid if it, well, hadn't been a rock, and if mermaids were real. Sibby Sisti was neither a rock or a mermaid. He was a utility infielder. And the argument is he should have been more than that, or in some reality he could have been. Sibby is short for Sebastian, by the way, in case you were wondering. And some of the olds among us, well, including myself, might recall that he got a little play later in life when he was a technical advisor to the Barry Levinson and Robert Redford adaptation of The Natural. If anyone in that movie looked like a real baseball player, that was on Sibby Sisti. Sibby had gone from high school to the pros at 17, and in 1939, the Braves rushed him to the majors from Hartford of the Eastern League. He had hit well there. If you add up his 2 seasons in Connecticut, he had 561 plate appearances and averaged 300 with a 374 on-base percentage and a 422 slugging percentage, 21 stolen bases and 29 chances. And that's good, right? 300 is better than 200, and certainly some teenagers go to the minors and hit 200 and then they go home. That said, what a teenager hits in 136 Eastern League games, never mind the higher minors like the American Association, the International League, or the Pacific Coast League, is not necessarily predictive of what he's going to do in the major leagues. But the Braves had an injury. They decided Sibby had to be the guy, and he ended up playing full seasons at 19, 20, and 21 years old, 1940 through 1942. By all accounts, Stengel was very kind to him, and Sisti said that he was, in fact, one of Stengel's pets, but he didn't hit much. Through 1942, his major league averages were 240, 301, 316. Then the war came, and whatever development he was going to do was preempted for 3 years. And who's to say that who he became after the fact was a continuation of where he was headed before? Still only 25 after the war, he couldn't make the Braves in 1946 and was sent down to Indianapolis for a year. He played really well there, hitting .343. That earned him another trip back up. Now, by 1946, Stengel was long out of his life. He was managing, as we've already noted, in the Pacific Coast League. And for most of the years remaining in Sisti's major league career, another 8 years, Stengel was with the Yankees. Stengel had no impact on Sisti's performance in the majors from age 25 up over the rest of Sisti's career, during which time he played for the Braves as a super sub. He hit .248 with a .326 on-base percentage and a .333 slugging percentage. You have certainly seen utility players hit worse than that, but he also wasn't in any way an impact player at the plate. As a right-handed singles hitter, he was playable against lefties, averaging .293 against them lifetime, but he had really severe platoon problems when it came to same-side pitching, unusually severe for a right-handed hitter. We expect it with lefties. Right-handers can usually battle same-side pitching to a draw, or they couldn't play. Well, Sisti, lifetime, hit only .219, .287, .288 against right-handed pitching, which are barely good-hitting pitcher numbers. Now, did Stengel ruin him by making him that way? Another player Egan was thinking of was shortstop Eddie Miller. And Miller is more complicated to talk about than Sisti because he was a 7-time All-Star. So how ruined was he? He was an odd player in that he was a defense first shortstop, and that itself is not unusual. It's that he was at times capable of being better than that. A couple of times he busted out with big offensive seasons, at least by his standards. The rest of the time, he couldn't hit. His career averages were .238 with a .290 on base and a .352 slugging percentage. But for the 1940 Braves, under Stengel, when he was 23, he hit .276 with a .330 on base and a .418 slugging percentage, including 14 homers in a tough park, which even now you would very happily take from your defensively superlative shortstop. Think of Andrelton Simmons. He was actually a fairly similar player. He had a couple of seasons like the one I just described, two that were very close. And if he'd had more of them, he'd be on his way to the Hall of Fame. But he couldn't, and neither could Miller. In 1947, he hit .268, .333, .457 with a National League leading 38 doubles and 19 home runs. This were the Cincinnati Reds. In the 6 seasons between his 1940 and 1947 campaigns, he averaged 227, 275, 322. I should note that while I don't know this for a fact, I would guess that the Braves and Stengel were only able to acquire Miller to ruin him because of Stengel himself, and specifically his friendship with Yankees farm director George Weiss. Before Weiss was the Yankees GM and Stengel his choice of manager, they did each other favors. Miller started out as property of the Reds, was traded to the Yankees for catcher Willard Hirschberger, setting up a tragedy we've discussed in a prior episode. The Yankees were pretty happy with their starting shortstop, Frankie Crosetti, still a fairly young player at that time, while the Braves needed everything. So, in August of 1938, Stengel's first season managing the Braves, the two teams made a trade, with the Yankees sending Miller to Boston in return for five players to be named later, and cash. The most notable of the five turned out to be pitcher Johnny Babich, who would figure heavily for the Yankees as an opponent in both the 1940 pennant race and during Joe DiMaggio's streak. Not for them again, but against them with the A's. The other notable player who the Yankees never used was Vince DiMaggio, Joe's older brother, who they dealt off again, and he went on to have 3-4 consecutive good years back in the National League. The cash in the deal was reported to be $50,000, and I have no clue where the Braves got it. Bob Quinn said, "If people knew what we were paying for Miller, they'd think Tom Yawkey was buying him, which was the whole problem." Miller was only 22, very much a prospect, although the knocks on him were totally consistent with what I've already told you about his major league career. Great fielder, inconsistent at the plate. As it turned out, he didn't like playing in Boston, did not like his Boston salary, did not like where the Braves were in the standings, and did not like Stengel, all of which was his right. Now, some writers said that all of the above made him a disgruntled player who didn't hustle. Stengel really wouldn't accept that. "Just see how many more chances he handles than do those other fellows," he said, "and you'll know he must hustle all the time." Nevertheless, in December 1942, he and Quinn dealt Miller to the Reds for pitcher Nate Andrews, infielder Eddie Joost, and cash. Miller didn't love it in Cincinnati either, and in January 1948, he publicly ripped the team, the manager, and several players by name, saying they would be lucky to finish in last place that year during an off-season speaking engagement, and the Reds did as you would expect and traded him to the Phillies. Miller's defense, he thought the comments were off the record. Yes, that old excuse. Now, did Stengel ruin him? There's no way to know, given that we're not capable of simulating a reality in which he came up under some other manager. But it seems to me that, given both the minor league record and what scouts said about him, he did about what he should have been expected to do, not to mention that he had the best offensive season of his career in Boston, and he actually had a very good career by the standards of your average player, just in the defense first shortstop department, not the all-around shortstop department. He was only a disappointment if you somehow think he should have been a great hitter as well. But if you think about it, that's a Hall of Fame level player. And that's not only saying a lot, it's putting a lot on a manager to say that he either created or deflected a player of Hall of Fame ability. You could say that Earl Weaver created one by making Cal Ripken, who is considered too tall to play shortstop, a shortstop instead of playing him at third base. And you could say something similar about Ed Grant Barrow moving Babe Ruth to the outfield or letting him play the outfield more often than he pitched. So there are positive examples, but they're few and far between, and this is not an example of that. This is simply an assertion that a shortstop who shortstopped was somehow denied realizing the fullness of his talents, which would include fielding like Ozzie Smith and hitting like Ernie Banks. And the next question that you have to ask is, so how many players like that have there been? Not that many. Hans Wagner, Ripken in his way, Lou Boudreau for a bit, Alan Trammell at times, not Derek Jeter, not Archie Vaughan, not Joe Cronin, not Ernie Banks. Devil Wells probably, though he played in some tiny parks. Barry Larkin probably works. That's 5 out of 20 Hall of Fame shortstops. Basically, Dave Egan was arguing that Casey Stengel killed a unicorn. Now, we have one more player to talk about, one I'm more ambivalent about than the prior two examples. I feel for this guy. I think in the end you will agree with me that the answer for him is similar to that for Sisti and Miller, but it's just a little bit messier because there may be some resentment involved. Resentment, not that the player failed to hit like Ozzie Smith and field like Ernie Banks. No, wait, switch that, reverse it. But because he wasn't Ted Williams. And the problem was not that wasn't unfair. It was, but it happened that they came from the same place at the same time, played the same position, and Teddy was always standing, well, pretty much right there. For some Braves fans, and maybe for some Braves managers, it must have felt like their team had the chance to marry one of two sisters, and not only had they made the wrong choice, but the other sister was always around to remind them of that fact. I'm here to remind you that we're due for the second and final break of the episode on the other side. An outfielder out of the West who went by the name of West. The one Braves prospect of this period I really feel for, because I think he really could have been good, was outfielder Max West. Miller seems to have had a difficult attitude. Sisti seems to have had a good one, but had limited talents. And because West was talented, Stengel actually did get frustrated with him and maybe did set him back some, although again, things like the park and the World War figure in as well. West lost his age 26 through 28 seasons to the war and couldn't get going again once he returned, at least not in the majors. He did have some huge seasons in the Pacific Coast League in the late 40s and early 50s, ironically, when Stengel was down there as well with the Oakland Oaks. He came out of the Pacific Coast League specifically via Casey Stengel. In the offseason, Stengel and his wife lived in Glendale, California. West was growing up and playing sandlot baseball in nearby Alhambra. I met him when I was a junior in high school, he said later. He would come around to the parks. He used to like to get together young players and take them over to Griffith Park, which is by where Dodger Stadium is now. He had balls and bats. He'd hit balls to us and throw, and we'd throw. That's all he did, or talked about baseball all his life. He became a good friend of my dad's. I was almost his adopted son before we got through. In 1935, West, 18 years old, signed with the Sacramento Solons of the Pacific Coast League. Stengel, then managing the Dodgers, convinced his team, Brooklyn, to take out an option on West. West's performance that year was middling, which shouldn't have been unexpected. He was only 18 and playing in a highly competitive minor league. He'd play the next two seasons for the PCL's mission team, San Francisco, the Mission Reds. And that was not because Sacramento gave up on him, but because the club had gone bankrupt and ended up in possession of its bank. West and the other players were sold to settle the club's debts. Branch Rickey actually ended up purchasing San Francisco for the Cardinals organization. Sorry, I mean that he purchased Sacramento for the Cardinals organization, but he had to staff it out with all new players. The Dodgers option seems to have expired because West was next reported as being tied to the Yankees. West played well for the Mission Reds in 36 and 1937, in the latter year hitting .330 with 16 home runs in 151 games. That same season, a slender 18-year-old outfielder named Ted Williams was completing his second season with the San Diego Padres in the same league. He hit .291 with 23 home runs in 138 games and was immediately understood to be a major prospect. Now, Stengel knew about him too. Stengel wanted to sign him for the Braves. He wanted to sign them both, perhaps. Quinn did not have the money to satisfy San Diego's price for Williams. Tom Yawkey did. Quinn was, however, able to scrape together the coin for West, who came to the majors in 1938. Williams came up in 1939, and from there through 1942, the two players from California played the same position in the same town. And of course, the comparison was inevitable. The problem was, of course, that there really was no comparison because there was only one Ted Williams, and West had his issues. West was a big for the time 6'1" left-handed hitter. He immediately showed some limitations as a 21-year-old rookie. He wasn't a very intuitive outfielder, and Stengel kept messing around with him at first base, in left field, in right field, in center field. That didn't help. West said so. Like a lot of lefties, he couldn't hit left-handed pitching. He actually hit pretty decently at huge pitcher-friendly Braves Field after his rookie year, but that's not the same thing as having Fenway Park on your side. In his rookie year, he played in 123 games and hit only .234 with a .300 on base and a .368 slugging percentage, only 10 home runs. That year, the park really did hurt him. 8 of those 10 homers came on the road, where he hit a solid .243, .321, .413. It was a pretty low-key offensive time. The league OPS was only .705. The next year, at 22, though, he took off, hitting .285, .364, .497 with 19 home runs. That was good, as Baseball Reference figures it, for a .137 OPS plus. By way of comparison, players in that same OPS plus zone in 2025 included, in different ways, Yandy Diaz, Bobby Witt Jr., Geraldo Perdomo, Jose Ramirez, and Matt Olson. Now, West gave some of that back in 1940, hitting only 7 home runs and had his averages ruined by a severe September slump. At the very least, he was dealing with injuries. He got hurt in the All-Star game at Sportsman's Park, where he actually had a big day. He started in right field, he batted third, and in the first inning, he hit a 3-run homer off of Red Roughing, which was functionally the game-winning hit. That was pretty much it for him, though, because in the top of the second, White Sox shortstop Luke Appling hit a line drive to the wall. He attempted, West did, to make a leaping catch, always a bad idea for Max, and he banged his hip and back pretty badly. He actually caught the ball, but when he slammed into the wall, it popped out, and he had to leave the game. He ended up missing 9 regular season games as well. That wasn't all of it, though. It wasn't just injuries. At least I don't think so. I do think that some of the slump was due to bad coaching by Stengel. By the standards of our time, West didn't strike out much at all, just 67 times per 162 games played during his first 5 seasons. By the standards of the pre-war National League, though, it was a lot. His 55 Ks in 1939 was enough to land him 8th on the league's top 10 list. In his book about the Braves up until the 1948 revival, the Boston sports writer Al Hirschberg said that Stengel was eager for West to cut down his swing and put more balls in play. The move was a ghastly mistake, Hirschberg wrote. It transformed West from a pretty consistent home run slugger into an inept bat waver, and it wrecked his confidence. Now, Hirschberg was probably telling the truth, and that would account for West dropping from 19 home runs to 7 between 1939 and 40. Instead of striking out every 8 at-bats, he struck out only once every 10. But here's the thing, Hirschberg, writing after the fact, generalized the statement to apply to West's entire Braves career as opposed to just 1940, when the statistics strongly suggest that one or both of Stengel and West discarded the failed approach after that year. In 1941 and 42, he struck out more often, once every 7.5 at-bats or so, and hit 12 and then 16 home runs, while also walking more often than before. And those seasons look very similar to his excellent 1939. His major league career basically consisted of 5 years, 1938 through 1942. In 38, his rookie year, and 1940, he was not great. The other 3 years, he was pretty good. He was certainly not Ted Williams, but he was a solid hitter, even with his platoon and park issues. But the way he was handled was still problematic. And Stengel's insistence that he could be made into a better player than he was, whether motivated by his own feelings as a teacher, whether motivated by envy of Williams, or his perception of what he saw on the sandlot that hadn't yet appeared in the major leagues and never would, it wasn't necessarily the right approach. And maybe you've had a teacher like Casey Stengel. I feel like I had several, in that he liked to teach young players. He flattered himself that he was a teacher of young players, but when the player couldn't do what he wanted, he would get frustrated, and then his capacity for humor would express itself in a negative way in the form of put-downs, insults, sarcasm. When Casey was hired by the Yankees, the publication Current Biography had a very perceptive note about him, and remember, this is before any of the Yankee stuff had happened. None of the Mets stuff. No one even knew there would be a Mets. They wrote, "Nobody thinks and talks baseball so exclusively as Stengel. Nobody knows any more about the game, but he is too much the purist, the theorist, the strategist. He is always trying to make a player pull something he's never tried before. If the player can assimilate it, he's the better for it. If he can't, Stengel keeps needling him with it until finally he is useless to the team." Now, I don't know if that's what happened with Max West because the war interrupted his career so severely. He never became useless, he just never took another step forward, and there was never a guarantee that he would. However, we can say that Casey was probably hard on the kid, as he was with Billy Martin and Mickey Mantle, harder than he might have been otherwise just because he expected so much from him. West later said, "In my particular case, he wanted me to do so good he hurt me." Reading that particular interview in full, it sounds like West was complaining specifically about moving him around the outfield. In 1939, for example, he played all three outfield positions in almost equal thirds. He also mentioned not liking the in-game moves between the outfield and first base. But he might also have been talking about the changes we've referred to regarding his offensive approach. Or possibly he might just have been talking about Stengel's impatient sarcasm. On one occasion, when Max ran into the wall trying to catch a fly and had to be carried off, Stengel's comment was, "Nice hands, Max." But my favorite version of this, and I've alluded to this story very briefly before, isn't nearly so vague as one time this was widely reported at the time because it's so bizarre. You could go through your whole life of watching baseball, thousands of games, and never see anything like this. On September 7th, 1941, the Braves hosted the Phillies at Braves Field for a doubleheader. The Braves blew out both games. The first, they won 17-6. The second, they took 10-1, with the Bees or the Braves getting homers from catcher Ray Bears, who didn't normally hit, and Carvel Bomarole, the second baseman, who actually could hit. And here's your second reference to the natural of the day. He's a guy who homered off a clock and may have inspired that scene in the movie. Max West was having a good day to begin with. He went 2 for 5 in the opener with a triple and a home run, driving in 2 runs, scoring 3 times. He went 1 for 3 with an RBI in the nightcap, and all of that would have been fine. In fact, this would have been a totally forgettable day at the ballpark between one team that lost 92 games and one, the Phillies, that lost 111, but for what West did in Game 2. In the bottom of the 4th inning of the second game, he came up with runners on first and second and 1 out. That at bat, he couldn't do anything against Phillies pitcher Tom Hughes, and he grounded out to the second baseman. Hey, the runners advanced, so today someone might call that a productive out. He hadn't hit into a double play, but he was kind of unhappy about it, as you would expect. The next batter was the veteran, future Hall of Famer, Paul Waner. So Waner steps in. West was walking slowly, ever so slowly, back to the dugout, head down, muttering to himself. Hughes threw a ball in the dirt that got past the catcher. The official scorer called it a passed ball. The runner on third broke for the plate. The ball rolled to a stop at Max West's feet. Having no awareness of where he was or what he was doing, still ground out. He picked up the ball. He tossed it to Phillies catcher Mickey Livingston, who simply turned and tagged the runner for the 3rd out of the inning. As the runner who had been on second, Buddy Hassett, came back to the dugout, he asked a gobsmacked Stengel, "Do you think they'll give West an assist on that play?" Now, West went out to play the field in the top of the 5th, as far as I know, uneventfully. In the bottom of the inning, he was back in the dugout. Waner resumed his interrupted at-bat. West was still upset, still berating himself, still not aware of the game. And he decided to lubricate his muttering with a trip to the water fountain. And somehow he timed that such that he arrived in the same place at the same time as a foul line drive into the Braves dugout by Paul Waner. It caught West in the mouth, knocked him unconscious. He ended up in the hospital with a lacerated lower lip and a few loose teeth. He missed the next 13 games. Now that is all fact. What I don't know is if this is also fact, that as the Braves ran over to, see if West was still alive, Stengel pushed through the crowd shouting, "Don't anybody touch him! Don't anybody touch him!" As if to say, "Don't crowd him! Give him some air!" Then Stengel looked down at his star pupil and spat, "Let him lay there. It might drive some sense into the son of a bitch." It might be true. It might not. It's what John McGraw might have said, and John McGraw was a huge influence on Stengel, although Casey always strongly insisted that he was his own man, and that one has to be his own man more than he was McGraw's. We can't ever know for sure if Stengel's frustration got the better of him at that moment. Did that ruin West? As with Sisti and Miller, who both played in that same September game, we can't know for sure how they would have done if they had played for someone else, because that simply didn't happen. The only thing we can say definitively is that 2 of the 3 players played more under other managers, and they were rarely better and often worse. We can also say that for 2 of the 3, Miller is the exception. He had too many dependents to go to war, that whereas we can't say anything definitive about their managers, we can sure as hell blame the fascists who took them away for 6 prime years combined. But hey, you know those fascists, they had some great ideas before they went too far. Should you wish to go so far as to follow me on social media, you can do so at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can also mail us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And there is still a Facebook group that really is going to change in the new year, I swear. Maybe not January 1st, but soon. Go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning, you will find us there. And a cartoon drawing of Max West too. Should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, please visit patreon.com/The Infinite Inning. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, just let your podcatcher lie there. Maybe that'll knock some sense into the son of a bitch. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who says, "You know who had a good idea before they went too far? Those breakaway Christian sects of the medieval period who all got massacred because they believed in worshipping in the nude. What if they'd just kept a sock on or something? Surely their persecutors would have had tolerance then." Well, if we can all just keep our pants on until I've figured out what our holiday stories are going to be, I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.